Hello, and welcome to my channel. This is going to be a longer video, so if you're looking for something specific, timestamps will be in the description. If you're new here, I'm purely a PvPer. I play every class in the game, and I've got guides and plenty of useful information here, so if you have questions, feel free to drop a comment. How this tier list works. Before we jump into rankings, I want to quickly explain how I'm approaching this video. First things first, player skill matters a lot. There's also a huge difference between North America and Europe playstyles, NA and EU. This is mainly focused on NA because EU heavily leans into ranged DPS, which definitely changes their meta entirely compared to ours. Keep in mind that tier lists are opinion-based and the meta always influences placements. My goal here is to help you choose the right class for you or to give you more context on classes you might want to try, while being honest as possible about where they currently stand. Because we're covering both arenas and war zones, the tier list will be split by format. For arenas, I'll be talking about all the major variations. So for example, if it's an all DPS match, so 8 DPS, or if each team has a tank and 3 DPS, and then heal DPS, and then obviously tank heal DPS, which are essentially the most competitive format. So that one will be a little bit more time spent on. I feel like I'm saying that backward. Anyway, I also won't be placing anything until after I've gone over each class. So if you're not interested in the playstyle breakdowns and you just want to see the rankings, feel free to skip ahead. I'll have it timestamped for you. Now, to cover war zones for the 8v8 format, obviously, most people already know that. Healers, the order will be Sorcerer number 1, Mercenary number 2, and Operative number 3. I won't really be going in-depth on healers or tanks in this video, but for 8v8s, this order is pretty clear. Main reasons why a Sorcerer is one of the best is the mobility that it offers, which is great for 8v8s. Movement is something that's very important for 8v8. And then when it comes to accessibility and just ease of play, Sorcerer also wins out versus the other two, which is very helpful. Then you would have a Mercenary. Well, it has great defensives, and it does make it a little bit better to be like learning on because the defensives can do half the work for you. It's still very immobile, so it's not exactly the same kind of playstyle. If you're not able to perform, you're not going to have a lot of fun on Mercenary. Mercenary also has to worry about its heat management, and it does become a little bit more of a balance. It is not as easy to play, but at the same time, it is still got some easy aspects to it. For example, its defensives. And then lastly, we have Operative. It has a really high, basically, actions per minute requirement. On top of that, it's a micromanagement healer, so you have probes that you want to maintain. It's not incredibly hard to maintain this anymore, as there's a lot of different heals that you can use to refresh your probes now. However, it is something that is extremely squishy. It doesn't have damage reduction, and while it has okay mobility, it doesn't really matter when it can't survive versus pretty much anything. It is a class that needs to either kite exceptionally well and or have guard and somebody to taunt for it pretty much permanently. Otherwise, the class is just not too great. As soon as this class has some sort of DR, it will be definitely one of the best, which there's only 3. So, I mean, I would imagine if Operative was to get stun DR, I can see it easily becoming the best, if not on par with Sorcerer. Thing is, mobility and things like stun bubble are just extremely valuable. However, flashbang is also extremely valuable. So it'd be really nice to see Operative be in a state where they don't feel like they need Hollow Traverse. But, you know, regardless, I'm not trying to get into a conversation about balancing for this. Just do know that I am experienced enough, even though I am not personally a healer. Anyway, now getting into tanks, the order is Assassin, Immortal, and Power Tech, this is specifically for 8v8, so if anybody's like, why are you putting Assassin number 1? Well, Assassin simply has the best tools and the best roll mitigation for 8v8. Juggernaut does have more damage and more of a aggressive playstyle for shutdown. And I do have to make a caveat here. The damage difference between Assassin and Juggernaut is that Juggernaut can always do damage. It doesn't need AoE to do damage. It can constantly put out damage, and it can stop doing damage and then randomly drop somebody for 100k. Assassin cannot do that. Assassin is a more of a sustained uptime kind of damage style. And on top of that, it also has nothing that hits as hard as Juggernaut can. So Juggernaut is definitely the powerhouse when it comes to just brute forcing and damaging players. Assassin's more of like a anti-cleave kind of situation where you're sustaining and trying to mitigate. But as soon as Juggernaut loses its offensive control or it gets pushed back, it really falls off hard defensively compared to the other two. And then you have Power Tech, which is mostly a melee counter, which is great for situations where there's a lot of melees. But with Scan being pretty much nerfed to the point that it may not be worth taking anymore, it ends up being in a situation where, one, it doesn't really do damage anymore. They nerfed its damage a long time ago, and with the Meteor Baller set being gone, it really just doesn't do that much damage at all. But with that being a thing, it has mostly utility to keep its team safe. However, that just doesn't really find the value anymore as it used to, as there's not a lot of melee currently in the game. Regardless, it is not a class that's really doing damage, so as a tank, you kind of feel useless because you've got Carbonize, you do have Electrocute, and you still do have Pool, which is great, but it kind of pales in comparison to the other two. While Juggernaut may not have Pool, Assassin still has a Pool, so it definitely falls behind. And that would be it for tanks. Since we have heals and tanks, we're just going to set those aside. Pretty much everything else is going to be breakdown per spec for DPS. And other than that, if you have any questions about healers or tanks, feel free to leave them in the comments. All right, quick interjection after doing an overview of all the classes. Before getting into the individual specs, just do know I do have footage for every single spec in the game, pretty much, except for healers. I don't really play healer. So if you're not really sold on the class or you just want to know more about it, feel free to check out either my guides for the class and or gameplay for the class. I play everything at a pretty high level. I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I do know how to play proficiently on most of the classes. I've been playing for a long time. It's only a given. However, there are still many things that I'm still learning about the game. And for the most part, I can say that I would be able to help people. And if I'm not personally able to help you, I can direct you to somebody that can help you. Other than that, I appreciate you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoy. And now to start with DPS Juggernaut. So we're going to start with Vengeance and Vigilance. This is also the same thing for Guardian as well. After the recent Cut to Pieces nerf, the spec has fallen a bit, but it is still very good. And you should still definitely respect it and its AoE. Its AoE is still strong enough to wipe groups pretty quickly. It's not as fast as it used to. And because it won't wipe as fast as before, we will likely see average or higher average damage numbers over the course of a match on this class. Its issue is mainly a single target compared to its peers. It lags behind, and relying on a tactical to fix that is not ideal. As a melee, it's naturally a frontliner, so if you're not prepared for that, I don't recommend jumping into PvP on this class blindly, as it gets tunneled and focused quite often. DPS, Jug, and Guardian also lack some meaningful damage reduction outside of Leap, so the moment you can't brute force fights with damage and control, its flaws will start to show quickly. A baseline Reflect would solve a lot more than blanket DR buffs. With too much DR uptime, this class can become monstrous. Rage also gets some rotational damage reduction, which would be another concern. While other classes can outshine it in certain areas, none can match the utility and ease of use. if you want high damage with the lowest effort, Vengeance and Vigilance is definitely unmatched. And just to give you a quick a view here, when you leap on this class, just in general, because of this talent, I believe this one right here, War Master is now available to all 3 specs. It's not just Vengeance only. It used to be Vengeance only, but now it's all 3. This will give you 20% damage reduction for 4 seconds. Anyway, when you leap, you get this little aura, if that makes sense. And you have immunity while you do that. That's where your damage reduction is also. And when you get out of combat, it also resets your enrage, your leap, and your saber throw. So this makes this class very good if you're able to quickly dispatch enemies. Let's say if you're playing rage, you'll be able to constantly get resets, and with those resets, you'll be able to constantly, basically, always have your burst. But obviously on Vengeance, it's a little bit different. So with that in mind, there are some really cool abilities if you guys are looking for a class to play. Force Scream, Impel, Hue, they're all beautiful. And then the animations alone with Vengeful Slam, absolutely amazing. I highly recommend playing Juggernaut. Juggernaut is a very fun class in Swtor. However, I can't really make too many comparisons. I would say Juggernaut's not completely like Warrior and WoW, but it's definitely kind of similar. And I see how a lot of people will compare it to like Arms. And then for like Fury, I would more say Carnage. Anyway, if you guys have any questions about Vengeance, I will show some clips just of the AoE as we're talking about this. And then also for getting into Rage here. Excuse my my loadout names. I don't really, I just play so many characters that I just don't spend a lot of time putting too much thought into it. Anyway, Rage and Focus, Juggernaut and Guardian. So these guys are the same thing, so Focus and Rage are the same. The spec takes the opposite approach, focused burst and single target. But it also has better mobility and it has some damage reduction directly built into the rotation. It's the king of noob slaying, quite literally, nothing really comes close to it. The control differences mainly come from Forced Crush, which is a slow. It slows people all the way down to 99%. So basically they have like 1% movement speed for like, it's like a split second. And then you also have a purging intercede. So instead of just using your intercede, you also have 5 seconds off the cooldown of your intercede, and you have a intercede that'll break roots, which is great. Or I believe, did they? I think they removed the 5 second. My bad, I've misspoke. I'm pretty sure they removed the 5 seconds off of intercede. So let me double check here. I know that was an old thing that was yeah. So they did remove it. I don't understand why they did that, but you know, sometimes they just make weird changes. Anyway, I'll say that you also have Obliterate. So this ability right here will allow you to basically attack people that are in cover. So like somebody's in cover and they're a decent distance away from you, you can still use Obliterate, whereas you would not be able to leap. So this does give it a slight advantage. However, Vengeance does have Skewering Impel, which allows them to kind of like leap to targets as well. Then getting into its rotational complexity compared to Vengeance. Vengeance is very one-dimensional and there's not much to think about here. But when it comes to Rage, it's a little bit more different because you're weaving your Destruction proc and you're also weaving your Enrage proc. So basically, you'll be looking at this Shockwave right here. And by Destruction proc, I kind of mean this. And then you also have another proc that you kind of pay attention to, which will be Dominate. And this is one of your stacks. So obviously, you're trying to get 2 stacks. The 0 cooldown build is not bad for Rage. I'm only spending more time here because there are some nuances to Rage compared to Vengeance. Vengeance is pretty straightforward. You play Slam Spam. There's not much more to it. But for Rage, you do have options. Now, when it comes to optimizing your rotation, it is very important to do, but also at the same time, you will feel the reward for learning your rotation and mastering it. It's very easy to just play it and do a lot of damage, even if you're not playing it optimally. But when you start playing more optimally, you will see the reward almost instantly, which is amazing. It feels very rewarding to play. Now, Rage and Focus naturally has to be the frontliner, just like Vengeance. It has the same damage reduction on Leap, so I can just show you that. It's pretty much the same as Vengeance, as we've seen already. When you have this aura, you have the immunity, and then you also have the damage reduction. But where this spec shines in comparison to Vengeance and Vigilance is that you're mainly trying to single target, or yeah, you're basically single targeting and bursting people, but you're also trying to single out people. When it comes to dueling, you definitely excel compared to most other classes, as you just have a better kit for it. On top of that, you are so good at being able to stay on target because you have a lot of tools that will allow you to, but also at the same time, it is just very difficult to kite a Rage Juggernaut. Obviously, skill gap is going to be a very big issue on this class. So if people are just really good and you're not very good at melee, that's going to be a problem. However, this will definitely make it a lot easier for you to stay on target, as this class is just really good at it. Anyway, not much to think about for Rage overall. However, highly recommend watching some videos to get an idea. Rotationally is probably the hardest thing about Rage. Other than that, everything else is pretty straightforward. Defenses are the same. You don't really get healing from your Enrage like you do on Vengeance, but overall, it makes it a little bit more simple. Now let's go into Immortal and Defense. This will be a little bit different because I just want to go through this faster, as we've already kind of placed tanks. If you're ever going to play tank and you're going to play just in general, like skink tank or whatever people will decide to call it these days, you're always going to want to use a shield. Don't be like me and use a focus. I just don't feel like changing my gear right now, but you'll always use a shield and you'll just throw DPS stuff in it. It is effective to play mitigation sometimes, but for Juggernaut, I don't feel like it is worthwhile. For Assassin, I do feel like it's worthwhile. For Pyrotech, I also feel like it's worthwhile, but for Juggernaut, your damage is too good. I don't really see a reason to run mitigation. Outside of that, Immortal is very interesting. Immortal in Defense has a really good defensive called Invincible right here. It gives you 40% damage reduction for 10 seconds. This is incredibly powerful. Probably the best defensive in the entire game. So learning how to use this properly and understanding damage windows, this ability right here will save and make completely game-changing impacts and like outputs. And on top of that, taunts are incredibly important, just in general. I didn't mention this in Rage or Vengeance, my bad, but it is very important. Taunts are like some of the most vital things. As a DPS junkie, you end up getting tunneled a little bit more, so taunts aren't as effective. However, whenever you're not being tunneled, taunts are massive. You have pretty good AoE options, but you also have really good single target options. So for example, you have this talent here. This increases your single target burst for the most part, but if you were to AoE taunt into a crushing blow, this does increase 40% for everybody that was AoE taunted. However, if you were to try the CDR crushing blow, which is this one's actually pretty good. However, you do need quite a few targets to actually get full impact of this. Most of the time you don't get that, but if you were to get into cleave, this is kind of nice. However, you don't want to be in cleave because it will get you killed that much faster. So it is, take it with a grain of salt. Then when it comes to 23, I just want to put this out here because it's really important. This is probably the best talent. I wouldn't bother with the other two, mainly just because the way Aegis Shield works. I'll show a clip so you can kind of understand. But in this clip, I use Aegis Shield to basically absorb extra damage that could have killed me. This doesn't just apply to yourself, it applies to everybody. So I highly recommend using that if you're going to play Jug Tank at all. And other than that, it kind of just lacks a God mode defensive compared to the other tanks. So when it comes to tank tunnel, you're a lot easier to be tank tunneled. The main thing that you have to protect yourself from tank tunnel is reflect, and Sometimes you're going to want Mad Dash because your ability is not as good. It's not as bad as PT, but you also don't have Hydros like PT. Other than that, there's not much to think about for defense or immortal. I do have a dedicated guide for all three of these specs, so if you are interested in that, feel free to check those out. Other than that, we're going to go ahead and move along. All right, now going into Marauder and Sentinel. We're doing it from the Sentinel perspective, as my main character is a Sentinel. Starting off with Fury and Concentration. Sadly, earlier into the expansion, they nerfed the spec more than once, ultimately resulting in removing its auto-crit completely. This greatly impacted its PvP performance. While the spec does fare better for PvP than the other specs Marauder and Sentinel have to offer, sorry, I got lost in train of thought there. It still lacks in the burst department while being completely designed around burst. Many will say that's a sustained spec, but honestly, Carnage does sustain better, especially for PvP. Marauder, unfortunately, was one of the most pruned classes and remains one of the most pruned, without any real love to help them perform better. In the current meta, I wouldn't recommend even playing the spec that I'm talking about now, though if you have interest in Rage or Focus, the rotational loop has some similarities. It's not a class designed to be the sole frontline by any means, but it does excel at dealing with range, even with a severe lack of tools that it used to have. With its damage lacking currently, this becomes much harder to do, leaving it in a weird place. Sometimes you feel completely useless. This is the true definition of playing literally anything else and finding more success with less effort. I love this spec. I hate the design currently. For reference, I'm a Marauder main, and my opinions are somewhat jaded here, but I do my best to remain mostly unbiased. If you're interested in a more bursty single target, even though its burst is not very good right now, that could potentially change. But for now, as far as I know, there's not any more balance changes coming, but there could be a change that eventually does happen. At the beginning of the expansion, we used to have auto-crit on Focus Burst and Raging Burst, where you could technically put it on anything, because when you pop Zen or Berserk, you would get an auto-crit. Now, with Sentinel specifically, why I'm a Sentinel and not a Marauder anymore is because of the AoE Focus Burst has double the radius of Marauder. So for example, this ability is actually good because it actually has a decent AoE radius. However, on Marauder, it is a terrible radius. So therefore, it wasn't very good. So the whole idea with that is that you were able to get an AoE auto-crit on people. That was really good. Marauder actually felt like it had multiple specs that it could play, and it felt good. Carnage was good. Fury was good. Annihilation was more niche, but too sustain heavy. So unfortunately, Annihilation still needs some more love. And honestly, Fury would be so much better if it was to receive its auto-crit back. However, the PvP and PvE balancing doesn't seem to be something that they'll be interested in doing. However, who knows? This is a very fun spec to play rotationally once you get used to it. However, again, I can't recommend it. I'll just show you here. So we have multiple different CC immunities. So for example, Gravity Vortex, you have to spec into this now. You didn't used to have to spec into this. This used to be free. So that's a sucky thing that happened. But use a Force Crush or Force Exhaustion here. It gives me this aura. This is CC immunity to every CC in the game. However, whenever I pop Saber Word, I have this other aura around my head. This still means I can get knocked back, but I'm immune to CC. Just knockbacks can still go through. So both of the CC immunities you have to spec into, which is obviously more than Annihilation. However, it's not really the best thing about Fury. The main reason why Fury is a little bit better off than the other ones is that you get defense chance right here. There's this one. Right. It keeps, yeah. Nope. I am wrong here. I remember the Marauder one. There it is, right? This one. So you get centered defense or concentrated defense. On Marauder, it looks a little bit different, and I'm a little bit more used to that one. But basically what that What that means is that you get 15%, or no, 10% defense chance for 6 seconds. It's not just a regular defense chance, it's also yellow damage defense chance. That got changed this expansion, which makes it a little bit better than what it used to be for PvP. This means you can randomly dodge a Raging Burst or like your Thermal Detonator, stuff like that. So if this spec was to seal off and a lot of the tools were replaced, Fury could actually be pretty good again. Anyway, that's pretty much enough about this spec. I want to show you one more thing. Obviously, Focus Burst looks pretty cool. Fury Strike's pretty cool. It's just a cool looking spec. Highly recommend it if you're just into more of the cinematics of the game, or I guess the aesthetics of the cinematics. My bad. Anyway, let's go ahead and just jump into Carnage, because I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time on this class just because it's my main, and I just want to keep it a little bit shorter. So first things first, instead of talking about it, I want to show you some of the abilities just because Carnage is a little bit different. So you have a chance to proc Ataru, so that automatically, like I'll automatically do that. There you go. So the second hit that happens, that's Ataru form. That looks pretty sick. I like that. I think that's thematically pretty cool. Now, when it comes to abilities, I wouldn't really say anything on combat really stands out. Not anymore, but it's not bad, I would say. Definitely the tamer version of Carnage. Carnage definitely looks a lot better, but I'm a big fan of the best ability in the game. My bad. I didn't even bother to use it. This one right here. That one, oh, just perfect. You don't actually get to see the sabers because you go through the wall, but it is a beautiful ability. Honestly, they really outdid themselves with that. When I saw that verse a long time ago, I was like, yep, I got to make a Sentinel. There's no way that I don't make a Sentinel. So it's kind of nice to have one on an Imperial side. Anyway, getting into Carnage. This spec actually made me fall in love with the class just in general. It has high action per minute, good burst, it's mobile, just had everything you would want in a burst melee without having poor sustain if you were to put in the time basically to be able to stay on target. Now it's far easier and its sustain is incredible. One of the highest next to Stormwatch when it comes to single target. Defensively, it lacks Fury, has an edge by the defense chance, obviously. Carnage really only gains a free CC immunity on Precision and Ferocity, so it's this ability right here. It's also global cooldown, so that's nice. You're able to get on-demand CC immunity. However, it's part of your core burst rotation, so you can't always just pop it whenever. However, it will make sure that you can get your burst off without getting CC'd. Now, also, Fury has to spec into its own CC immunity. I think it's kind of backwards. I don't think Fury should have to do that anymore. And previously it didn't have to, so that change should really be undone. I think Annihilation also should get some sort of CC immunity as well. But the day that they do something about Marauder will be a great day. I don't think that's happening anytime soon. I would say out of all three specs for Marauder, without spoiling it, I do think Carnage is definitely the best one. The spec has burst, sustain, mobility, and arguably one of the fastest moving classes in general, and it just looks pretty cool. A little biased there. Though Force Scream is definitely way better than Devastating Blast and, was it Clashing Blast on this one? Yep. Other than that, let's go ahead and jump into Annihilation. We're not spending too much time here. Now this is another spec that I truly love, like Carnage. However, it is purely turned into sustained spec. Some specs are basically that and balanced around that way currently, and it's not great for PvP, as obviously uptime is everything. In this meta, uptime is not very high, burst is king, and sustained specs are kind of falling flat unless there's constant uptime. This spec really needs an auto-critical, just like Fury, to really thrive damage-wise for PvP. It has some decent self-healing, and that's the main gain over the other two specs here. So in arenas, the spec can sometimes find more success in 4 DPS or 3 DPS games. Defensively, it does not have the same problems with the sustained damage profile. It's just far easier to shut down and deny, if that makes sense. So it's how to put it, like, you can heal a lot, but that's assuming that you're able to have uptime. If people shut you down properly, you're not healing. So therefore, defensively, it's a 50-50. If you have uptime, then defensively, you're better than the other two. But if you're not able to have uptime and you're basically focused target, you're not going to have the advantage, which is quite unfortunate. You're also probably not going to have any damage, which is just a massive loss. I don't think the spec is doing as bad as Fury, but I also don't recommend it unless you're a diehard melee fan, as you have to stay within 4 meter range the entire time to do any sort of effective damage. However, it does have some pretty cool abilities. Unfortunately, I'm not on Roger, so I can't show you the coolest one in the game. However, I can show you some of them. So this is Rupture. Rupture used to be a huge part of your rotation. Now you kind of just put it on the target and you spam slash. That is the basis of the class at this point. However, there could be some nuance added into the game, as I suggested before in the past. Instead of just making this implant auto-create your slash or your dispatch, it could also auto-create your merciless slash. So you could have some skill ceiling here and use the unprocced Twin Saber Throw, then get the procced Twin Saber Throw to get a double Annihilate auto-crit, kind of back-to-back. However, obviously, Annihilate still has a cooldown, and if you use Annihilate 4 times, you'll have reduced cooldown on it. So you kind of get the idea of being able to min-max that and maximize that. I think that's a little nuance that could make this spec a little bit more in-depth compared to the other two. And I miss that. It's, you know, an RPG. I would enjoy to have some depth in my MMO RPG instead of just nothing, you know? Anyway, then we have Force Rend, kind of whatever. Rupture is kind of cool. These are the Republic versions, obviously, and then Annihilate. That one is pretty cool. On Annihilate, you kind of like drag both of your lightsabers and flip upside down and stab like an X through people. It's pretty sick. And then obviously Twin Saber Throw is just awesome. And you have a reset for Twin Saber Throw, so that's just even better. Other than that, you're basically doing a mixture of dot damage and physical. And every time you use slash, you'll refresh your dot tick, and then dual saber throw as well. But other than that, that's pretty much Annihilation. There's not much to think about it. Defensively, it's almost the same, and offensively, it is literally just spam slash for half of your rotation, which feels quite bad. However, hopefully we could see some change. I've given a lot of feedback on Router, but whether they will listen is another thing. The spec is definitely not useless. All 3 specs on Router are definitely worth learning. They're pretty fun. However, if you're not good at melee and let's say you have frame rate issues, I probably would just skip over Marauder because it has a unique interaction with predation, which causes quite a bit of lag, and it's kind of hard to control if you're lagging all the time. Anyway, that's Marauder. Now, immediately going into Assassin and Shadow for Deception, Infiltration, Hatred, and Serenity. Going off script here, as I just wanted to be more natural for you guys. The spec has some cool abilities, so I'm going to show you that just first. So this one, Photonic Slash, what is it, Clairvoyant Strike here. That one is pretty cool. You've also got Ball Lightning, which is just, you know, it's obviously going to be called different things on Republic. These abilities, pretty cool, pretty straightforward spec. It is definitely one of the easier classes to learn for PvE. However, for PvP, you are very squishy, so take it with a grain of salt on learning your burst rotation and being able to optimize your burst, but also your mobility is very important. The class is pretty mobile, has excellent burst. It is a very powerful spec to play. It's great for 4 DPS. It's great for like heal DPS, tank DPS. However, healers definitely make your value a lot less than what it could total and or what it could be in total, if that makes sense. As an assassin, typically you will end up being a liability with a healer, unfortunately. However, sometimes it can go in your favor, so do keep that with a grain of salt. Other than that, in 8v8s, you're great at dueling and small scale skirmishes, and then also you're not much of a team fighter, but you do have a talent option that actually makes it possible for you to team fight a little bit more effectively with the sorcerer meta. Currently, this talent right here actually makes it a very much so a powerhouse against them. Whether you're just dealing with Sorks all the time and you just want better survivability, or you're just trying to be a team fighter, this talent is actually great. Giving up the crit chance, horrible. Doesn't feel good. However, the damage reduction is actually excellent. And this damage reduction isn't just regular damage reduction, also includes internal and elemental. So to give you guys a glimpse of how much damage reduction you actually end up having here, let's get down to defense here. So you have 15%, and you already have some built-in stacks that will also give you damage reduction. But once you get this maxed out, you'll end up having 29% internal and elemental damage reduction. That's actually a lot, especially for a DPS. So you're actually able to just tank sorcerers pretty well, actually, which is super nice. However, you're still vulnerable to a lot of damage just in general. However, this definitely helps your survivability. So if you ever feel like you need the survivability and you want to be more of a team fighter, that's a great talent. It's actually pretty good. I do think we should get this for free, honestly. But at the same time, maybe they could nerf it a little bit. I don't know. Ultimately, I just feel like it sucks to have a defensive versus a offensive in the same row. It just doesn't make any sense. It feels very bad. This spec has been lacking damage reduction. It has some passive damage reduction into its tree. However, ever since they removed Facing Phantasm, it's just not great defensively. Other than that, it's very bursty. Its opener is usually from stealth, so you'll have 6 seconds of 100% crit window, so you'll be able to do your burst rotation. So when you use Phantom Stride, you'll get a 4-stack discharge, or 3-stack discharge, or Force Breach. Then you can Recklessness, do it again. Then obviously, for the most part, during that 100% window, you want it to depend on what you're prioritizing, whether it be Maul or Reaping Strike. There's multiple different builds that you can do. There's also even AoE Discharge, which is great. I actually have a lot of fun with that. So that is something to keep in mind. However, Deception in general has a lot of CC available to it, so you can take Overload. That's actually pretty good sometimes. And then you can also take Lift. Most of the time you'll just never do that because Shroud is just better, but if you're ever just like not in a situation where you are a target, Lift can actually make a massive difference. I have actually tried this talent right here, Cleaving Cut, with the passive, the new passive that it does. It's actually pretty strong passive as well. However, it just lasts for too little. 3 seconds is just not enough to find a lot of value. However, it's kind of fun to play with. Very interesting that they did that. I do think it should be slightly better. It actually makes it not completely useless, if that makes sense. Then I also think the Cloak of Resilience, I don't even understand why it's not baseline. However, you still get a purge for free now when you stealth out, so it's not the end of the world. Other than that, Deception is pretty straightforward. I don't think it's bad, but I also don't think it's good. It's not meta, but it still has its uses. Going into Hatred, another one that I really love. Hatred is one of the most played specs for me. It'd be Warrior, then I want to say Assassin. No, a warrior than Assassin. Not specifically Sorcerer, but it'd be Warriors, so both Rod or Juggernaut, than Assassin. Anyway, getting into this one. This one is obviously dot based. You have a new talent now that will allow you to basically use Eradicate. So that's a dot, but it'll do all of its ticks within 1 second. This is still considered a dot. It's not a single target burst ability or anything. So you can use this through Reflex, and it still melts people. So if you're a mercenary, you're trying to kill a mercenary, Hatred's really good at it. You can just use your Eradicate right through their Reflect and still kill them anyway. And then you also have Death Field, and you also have a build that will pretty much reset your Death Field all the time. So if you're dot spread, you can spam Death Field over and over each time somebody dies, but also you get CDR for your Recklessness, and the CDR for your Recklessness means that when you use your Recklessness, you get a free stack of Death Field, which is quite nice. Other than that, your other abilities are simple, pretty basic. On Serenity, they basically have no animation, so you're kind of just putting dots on people and looking for resets. And since you have Stealth Out and you can take it down to 1 minute 30. It makes the spec turn into more of a reset kind of monster instead of like slam spam or like pyro or other AoE specs in the game. You're kind of looking at getting your 100% crit window by spamming 3 death fields and eradicate, and then doing your dot spread or doing your dot spread before, and then going to self out and then redoing it and trying to do your burst. And you can chain, I'll actually show on screen, where I chain multiple kills over and over and over, where I just spam death field over and over and over. It's absolutely beautiful. I love it. It's amazing. It's super fun. I highly recommend playing this spec. It is the squishiest thing you'll ever play, but it'll be the most fun you had while dying in 2 seconds. Other than that, Hatred is not complicated by any means. It's actually super easy to play. It's probably got one of the lowest skill ceilings, I would say, in terms of just being able to do damage. However, the hard part of it is staying alive. And then, even then, there's limits to that because it is so squishy. It doesn't have damage reduction outside of its AoE taunt, and its AoE taunt is only going to last for 6 seconds. So, with that in mind, I don't talk too much about Hatred, but it's very fun. The only thing really holding it back is that it doesn't have damage reduction. And it is also a very unique playstyle. There are other ways to play Hatred. However, I just don't find them viable in the current meta. Anyway, moving on from that, let's go into Darkness briefly. Now, obviously, you'll always want to use a shield over a focus. I'm just not bothering to swap my gear out for any of this. The whole ideal here for Darkness is that you're going to want to maximize your damage just in general. You're not always going to focus on damage. If you're playing mitigation, you're going to basically maximize your taunt uptime on somebody. So when you have 3 stacks, it makes this uninterruptible, but it also makes it do more damage. However, it still does good damage if there's a lot of targets. You can 1 stack it, 2 stack it, 3 stack it. It doesn't really matter as long as there's multiple targets. So if you're using the AoE, depredating bolts, or as in this case, it's cascading debris, it's a very good damage. However, it's not always the best thing to do. Darkness excels at being kind of like an anti-cleave kind of tank. However, it also has pretty big vulnerabilities, if that makes sense. If it doesn't have something to hit, it's not able to heal itself. If it's not able to heal itself, it's not as effective, like almost anywhere near as effective as it usually is. Mitigation usually gives up a lot of damage. However, if there's cleave, it still is able to do respectable damage and a lot of healing. As you've seen on my channel, I've done 26k multiple times on this spec. It is very easy in general to do. It's not impressive by any means. It's just some random games that I got that I wasn't even taking seriously. So I know that this spec is able to do way more. And on top of that, it is just very AoE heavy. So when it comes to spamming AoE, it's not really a skill. It's just kind of spamming AoE in a general vicinity. Damage numbers can be very high, so don't get the false perception that this spec is better than what it actually is. The main reason why you want to have a Darkness tank is because of this aura right here. This is the best thing about Darkness. And then the second best thing about Darkness is the uptime on your taunts. You have better uptime on your taunts than any other tank. And then on top of that, you also have better CC uptime as you have more CC available on a lower cooldown. Other than that, there's not much to think about it. If you want a more in-depth overview of a tank, obviously check out my guides. Other than that, we're going to move on from this class. All right, moving on to Operative. This one is going to be a little bit more loaded than the other ones just because it has a lot more to go through. If you're interested in a pretty high skill ceiling, but also just a pretty good skill floor, if that makes sense, Operative is probably the best class to play, especially Lethality. Lethality is able to do so much with such little effort, but also at the same time be able to do so much more with time spent and learning how to play it. Now, with that out of the way, Lethality specifically, it is pretty simple. So you have 2 dots, and then you have a basically white damage dot, which is ranged. Put down your haze, and then use your backstab. That's literally the whole class. And that was the whole class for a long time. And people did nothing more than that and never really truly learned how to do single turret damage with the class. They would just spend the rest of the time off healing and rinse and repeat. Now, there's not anything completely wrong with that, and that's not necessarily the wrong way to play. That's just an example of how little effort that you can actually put into the class, and it still does well. However, when you start running into better players, you have to put more effort. So that is just one thing to keep in mind. Like when I said for Fury, you could just put in half the effort on this class and outdo Fury. Like it's almost impossible to lose to Fury as this class. Anyway, getting into it, it has a lot of tools available to it. It was basically one of the classes that felt like it didn't get pruned at all going into this expansion. As you can see, I'm only missing one thing on my bar, and it's flashbang. I don't feel like I really needed it in the first place. However, there are some times that I do find flashbang to be very useful. Now, going into how it plays, it can be a frontliner, which is insane to think about. An off-healing spec able to frontline, yeah. This class has a lot of damage reduction, it has a lot of tools to get in and out, but also at the same time, it's able to take a lot of damage and mitigate it very well. It also has a reflect built into its evasion if you decide to take the talent. So very nice. Sometimes highly recommend using it because the QOA is very burst heavy, so you can get some insane value from this talent. Other than that, it is, again, as I said, pretty easy to play. This class is obviously going to be ranked pretty high because it's very strong. You have multiple options, so you have the ability to heal. I go into, in my guide, kind of like how to micromanage your healing and your damage. And I have several videos and arenas where I've played against 4-mans and like 3-mans and whatnot, SoloQ, and I'm just still winning. You can roll and then you can get a heal. I don't have my keybind set, so I'm just clicking it. I don't actually click. But you have Cult of Infusion there after you roll for free. That allows you to heal a lot more. So pretty much after every single backstab, you can roll and get a free infusion. Obviously, that's only assuming that you actually use your lethal strike every 12 seconds or 11 seconds. Other than that, it is pretty simple. You're able to cleanse, which, you know, cleansing classes just have a natural advantage, and healing is good. I feel like I would have more to say, but I feel like there's not much to it. It's actually really simple in terms of just playing the class. It's just the nuances of learning how to maximize everything that you got, if that makes sense. And then when you have talent points, this is what I would say that you usually swap is whether you would take a reflector or a CDR evasion. That's like really the only build differences that you usually end up taking. And then you also have the potential to not take Hellish versus Flashbang. Sometimes that's pretty good. And then you have the AoE tactical or the Swtor tactical. And that's pretty much it for lethality, I guess. I feel like I should have more to say for it, but I guess not. If you guys have any questions, obviously feel free to leave them in the comments. I will obviously show my guide as well. Anyway, let's go to Concealment. Oh, I guess hold on. Let's go back to lethality before we finish lethality. It's damage. That's one thing I guess I didn't really explain. So basically what happens here is you have 3 dots, you do this, and you kind of just do damage from your dots and Corrosive Assault, Shiv, Corrosive Assault. You're kind of just maintaining your tactical advantages and spending them, and then reapplying your dots. Its damage is not bursty, not anymore. It doesn't really do insane damage. It does a lot of damage to the tank because it's dots. All dots in the game pretty much do most of their damage to the tanks because you're double dipping. If they guard anybody that has dots in them as well, you're taking 50% of the damage from those dots. So naturally, you're just going to do more damage to the tank. It's indirect tank tunnel. That's just the meta for pressure. Anyway, yeah, that's pretty much it for lethality. Let's go to Concealment. So for Concealment, the main thing that you have to think about is that while there are times that you can take the lacerate damage increase and the cooldown reduction for stim boost, it's not always viable. The damage reduction is going to be better. You're going to be able to off-heal yourself. You're going to be able to survive a lot better. If you're not taking this, it is very obvious and people will kill you pretty fast for it. This class is probably the squishiest class in the game when it doesn't have this up, if that makes sense. So it is very important to try to maintain this, but also pretty much always take it. Once you get more comfortable, then branch out to the other ones. Otherwise, you're going to find it miserable. You also have a reduction on your evasion with this talent, and it also gives you like a mini pred. This is very fun to play with, especially with Second Wind. However, it's not always ideal. Hard Stun is very valuable on a burst DPS. Then obviously you have the Reflect or the other one. So basically most everything else is still the same here. Now I don't have my tactical on, so this isn't going to be accurate for its damage, but obviously you'll use a Volatile into Shiv and then Backstab. And that'll be like your burst, and then you're going into like Sustain. Same ideal. You're basically min-maxing your tactical advantage stacks and then pretty much spinning your filler. Not so much to think about. Between that, you also have God Roll. So during your roll, you're actually immune to damage, and then you have like half a second that you're also immune after your roll ends. So it does give you a little bit better defensive profile, and then you also just have the damage reduction, which can be arguably better sometimes than lethality. However, you don't have the same off-healing power, so you do have to be careful and understand the balance between off-healing and doing damage. And you also usually will not take the reset, as this talent is just better, which means that you will have to be a little bit more safe, as you won't have a second shield probe, and shield probe doesn't really help you on the spec, as it doesn't give you damage reduction like it does in lethality. Other than that, there's not much to think about for Concealment. It is a 4-meter range spec, however, it has tools. I highly recommend Crippling Throw, because it's a more of a ranged one. It allows you to stay on target a little bit easier instead of having the auto-critical one, because the auto-critical one is way too easy to outplay. Almost everybody plays a range class and or a class with a knock, so anytime you have to deal with one of those, they're pretty much always going to knock you on that ability, so it's much better to just have this version. Most of your damage is going to be lacerate anyway, so it is definitely a better idea to prioritize your lacerates. Anyway, I don't really think there's anything else for Concealment. Feel free to leave any questions in the comments. I'll be more than happy to help. This class definitely has a lot more nuances to it. I do have a guide for it. And we'll be skipping over medicine, as personally I'm not the person that should be talking about healers. However, I do know the bare minimum. There's just no place for it in this tier list. All right, now it's the next class. We're going to start off with Vanguard and Pyrotech. This is Tactics. I feel like I've not been calling classes correctly the past two. Sorry for that. Anyway, moving into this is basically the same thing as Advanced Prototype. This spec is very good. It's been good since 6.0. At the end of 5.0, it was pretty good, but it wasn't the top of the meta for sure. It was like maybe third best. However, it's been good for quite a while, and for the most part, it is not too hard to play. One of the biggest issues with a lot of PT players is that they end up overheating. They don't learn their heat management, and they're just, and for the most part, not learning their rotation, which is completely fine. It's actually really easy to learn its rotation. I currently have number 1 for the PvE parse for this class, but I also have highest for war zones as well. Which is a cool little feature. If you guys actually like to do like, which I might as well bring this up. I don't understand why I'm doing it in tactics, but regardless, there is a website that Ivana runs that has like a leaderboards for PvP. Very cool. Highly recommend checking it out. It's pretty cool. Then parsing plays a big role in PvP. Definitely understand your rotation. But that's the main issue that you see with this class. It's really the only weakness this class has. It has very simplistic defenses, and they just kind of do what they're supposed to do. So for example, you have Energy Shield, just gives you damage reduction. Can't be more simple than that. It's great. But for the most part, the reason why you would want to play this class is because it has mid-range. So I can hit people from this far. That's crazy. It's not necessarily a melee, but it's not necessarily a range either. It's kind of in between. There are some abilities that you have to be up close for. So for example, Retractable Blade. And you also have a Super Deadly Burst, one of the best bursts in the game. The only burst that kind of like compares is, let's say like Arsenal, if everything crits. Then Engineering, obviously, very deadly. Then AP, I would say those are like the top 3 highest burst windows that you could possibly see in the game. I say Arsenal, a lot of people are probably gonna be like, what do you mean Arsenal? Yeah, well, Arsenal can up to 140k with Vortex Bolt and what was it, Priming Shot or whatever. And then Heatseeker can hit up to 90k, and a Roll Shot can still hit 100ks. So that's actually super deadly and on par with most other burst DPS. The main issue of Arsenal is that it's white damage and it misses a lot. And it's also a lot of channeling, and a lot of people just simply don't sit there and channel as much as they should. They play it too defensively. Anyway, regardless, this isn't about Arsenal. Its burst is its strong shoot and its ability to basically be medium range. Its defenses are simple, so therefore it makes it a low skill floor, but I would say it does have like a semi high skill ceiling. There is a plateau that you definitely hit. Anyway, I'll show you a quick glimpse of its burst just because it's definitely something that you would want to see if you're going to play this spec. I would say this is an optimal burst rotation, but regardless, as you see, it just pours out damage like crazy. I don't even have my correct stuff on. But for the most part, the whole ideal is to basically, with this ability, since it's delayed, you're going to sync it with another ability to basically stack the damage together. Obviously, you'll stack that with Cell Burst because it'll hit really hard. However, if you're going for a maximum damage opener, you don't necessarily do that. At least not for parsing. When it comes to PvP, the whole ideal is to do something like this, as it'll allow you to get the most damage in like a split second. And normally you'll already have bleed on them, so you would be able to punch into energy burst and then roll shot after, so your energy burst would be lined up with your assault plastique. Other than that, that's pretty much the burst for the spec. It is insanely powerful. It's one of the best, and when it comes to competitive arena, it's definitely the top dog. When it comes to melee, this is like the apex of melee currently with tank and heal. When it comes to just regular AV8s, there are situations where PT is very good. However, things like Rage can outperform it. Other than that, that's pretty much it for AP. There's not much to think about. Simplistic, very strong, very good. Going into Plasma, this is basically the same thing as Pyro. The whole ideal here is that you have dots and you're kind of just super tanky. So instead of just having a shield, your power load, all right, power yield or whatever, so it's Duracell armor for here, doesn't last for just 10 seconds, it lasts for 30 seconds now. And then your Colto has damage reduction tied to it. It also gets CDR on hit. So if people are hitting you a lot, you'll get your Colto back up quite often, so you'll end up being very tanky, and then you have 2 dots. So this thing just like sits on top of people's heads for 30 seconds. It's insane, it's kind of funny. I love it. Then you have Incendiary. That's the one that you mainly spread, so you use your wave basically to spread that. You have Punch. Your Punch will end up rooting people. You can also take the AoE Punch talent. Highly recommend it. And then you have like your main burst ability. So it'll be this one, and then Roll Shot. Really, you're kind of just playing with basic PT abilities and Vanguard abilities. However, the main difference is that you have AoE Punch, you have Plasma Flare, not Fear, and then you also have, so it'd be like Immolate. I would definitely say Pyro looks a lot better, but Plasmatize is also pretty cool, I won't lie. So the whole idea here is to permanently maintain your dots and then constantly spam AoE basically, and then like use your abilities on cooldown. There's not much to it, it's very simplistic, just like AP. Same problems pretty much. You overheat and or you have a situation where you're just not maintaining your dots. Simple basic rotational errors that people do. And then there's also just really bad Colto usage. Colto usage is probably the hardest thing about Pyro. Other than that, it's pretty simplistic, very good. Kind of has a semi-medium range like other ones, but it wants to be in the fray and it wants to spam AoE and it wants to keep people stacked. So very interesting spec. It is the best cleave spec that is tanky next to Lethality, both the tankiest cleave specs in the game. And the whole idea with them is that they have dot damage reduction as well, so they just oppress the other cleave specs in the game. However, AP just outshines in general. So most of the time or I guess tactics as well. AP tactics, same thing. So you probably really won't see Pyro as much. However, it's very good. And then going into probably the least useful tank. However, it does have its uses, but with its what do you call it? With its scan being nerfed, it's not as good. And apparently we don't even have a tank loadout. That shows you how much I don't play it. It's not the same anymore. So the whole ideal here is that you have Riot Gas. Riot Gas is this little ability right here. So when I pop this reduces the accuracy of players. This only works against melee and ranged abilities. So if you're doing wide damage, basically, this is only effective against them, as long as they're in the radius of it. And then you have what do you call it? Is it energy loss? Which one is this one? I don't even remember. Probably that's punch. Is the flamethrower equivalent. This is probably the coolest thing that it has. Ion Storm. This ability misses quite often, so it's pretty inconsistent, and it used to be a primary source of damage outside of just spamming Flame Soup. Unfortunately, since they nerfed the damage way back in, I want to say 5.9 or 5.8, PT Tank has kind of fallen off in damage. It's not very useful. It has good utility. It's good anti-melee. Unfortunately, not a lot of melee these days, which is definitely going to hurt its viability. I guess this is not punch. Oh, this is okay. I know what this is. Don't remember the name, but regardless, where's a punch? Here's our punch. Okay. So for the most part, you're kind of just trying to apply. Oh, holy crap! That's a loud scream. Basically trying to do damage through that ability, right? And then you can also reset it and do more damage out of that. But other than that, you're really just spamming Flame Soup, which is kind of nice since you're doing AoE damage. You're not actually paying attention to who you're targeting, which allows you to either perma-target somebody and spam taunt on them, and or just kind of permanently have your mouse hovering over targets that you want to hit, because it's not important for you to worry about who you're trying to hit. So like if you do have AoE, it's like the one advantage that this class has over the other ones is that you can kind of just target the person that you already want to guard, and then in between your cities you can target swap and you can pre-target people that you wanted to guard, which is quite nice. It is a pretty good defensive tank, especially against melee. Against range it falls flat, and it is almost impossible to tank tunnel because of how strong it is defensively. It's also very good for mitigation. It becomes like a really hard to kill tank. However, there are some internal and elemental damage specs that can still shred it, so do take that with a grain of salt. Very simplistic, very easy to play, not much thought to it. It is probably the least thought, most boring class for tanking. However, it has some cool utility, like you can pull your ally, you have double grip, so that means you can just pretty much make sure nobody gets away, or just really annoy one guy. But other than that, yeah, this tank it needs some love. I'll show you the coolest thing about it, though. I think it's this one right here. Yep. This is the old ability that we used to have. This thing is amazing. I love it. I wish it was better. I really would love to see PT Tank do more damage again. However, that's unfortunately just not the current place that it's in. And this ability is just meant. I love it. Other than that, Firestorm, you just end up missing it a lot. I would only recommend this tank if you're trying to get into the ideal of like trying to learn how to play tank in PvP, especially if you're playing with somebody that you can guard. It's a very simplistic, not much thought to it. Always can spam Flame Sweep, use your other abilities. You can find success without really putting much effort into it. Other than that, that's pretty much it for PT. We'll go ahead and move on. Or yes, Vanguard, move on. All right, now to talk about the first range out of all this. This one is very fun. So if you're looking for a highly mobile range that doesn't have to sit still too often, However, it is very optimal for maximum DPS. This is still a decent amount because there are a lot of channels that you'll want to get off and maximize for best DPS. However, it doesn't need to. It's still very effective if it doesn't. Very fun class, very enjoyable, relatively easy to play, so the skill floor is pretty high. It's able to perform in a decent way, as you could say, with low effort, if that makes sense. And the better you get at it, the better it's going to do with low effort. Very fun overall, in my opinion. I think I highly recommend this pretty much for everybody. It recently got buffed, so I'll show you some of the cool animations that's got. Lightning Flash, absolutely amazing. But there's also an ability that recently got buffed that was actually nerfed because it was too strong, which will be this one right here. The one that just hit 120k. That ability got nerfed and recently got buffed, so this thing is going to be an absolute monster. Anyway, that's a 61k crit without a crit. That's pretty gross. It is really strong. And then you also have the AoE talent that I prefer to use. I like to run the Chain Lightning a lot more because it's more into the old school SoloQ. As soon as I get out of combat, Storm Watch kind of just keeps you in combat forever because it constantly just keeps hitting as long as you have the dot on the target. This class has a lot of AoE roots and just AoE slow, so you're able to AoE like control teams, which is very powerful. So Lightning Flash, very cool. Thundering Blast is kind of whatever. And then you have Chain Lightning, and then you also have a build that allows you to use your Volt Rush. Then reset your Chain Lightning, so you're able to Chain Lightning again. Chain Lightning is the AoE root, so you can kind of quickly see how this class can permanently root people. I'll show some clips on screen. It's very fun. Defensively, it has damage reduction built from using most of its abilities. So for example, with Lightning Bolt, getting these bolts out will build these stacks, which will increase your damage reduction. So it's very important that if you want to survive and people are hitting you and getting your stacks to maximum so you can get damage reduction is very important. The survivability on this class isn't terrible, but against a lot of the melee in the game that are able to pretty much permanently upkeep uptime on you, it is sometimes pretty hard against good players, especially good melee, to survive on. It is not completely paper, so with support, you can definitely deal with the enemies. One thing that I would say, as all range players should prioritize people that are the biggest threat to you, not just the biggest threat to like number farming or whatever. It's like whoever's going to kill you, you need to prioritize that. Otherwise, you're not really playing the class to its fullest, and you're pretty much just going to have a bad time. The whole advantage of playing a sorcerer is that you're able to attack them before they can ever attack you. Now, with that in mind, overall, I would say it takes some time learning. Range positioning is a lot harder. This class has a lot of tools to help you get used to mobility and immunity to roots and whatnot. So when you go to another range and you still haven't really learned too much, this class is going to make you hate every other range in the game. It's not going to feel as good. So do take that with a grain of salt if you're still new and you're trying to look for a class. This is a highly recommended class. However, just do keep in mind that it has way better mobility than all the others. Other than that, that's pretty much it for Lightning. It does a lot of AoE damage. It's really fun, and as you've seen through the clips, it is pretty cool. Now let's go into Madness. Arguably, I would say this is the most boring one. So the whole ideal here is that you get your dot out, you get your other dot out, you drop your depth field, spreads all those dots. Demolish only spreads if you have the tactical to make it spread, and it works retroactively. So let's say if you did Creeping Terror, Affliction, got your dot spread to like 7 people, and let's say they're still there. You could then force Lightning into your instant Demolish and still spread. It would still work. This Death Field would be on all those people, and your initial target Demolish basically spread off of. So you could do it either way. You could do it all at once, or you could do it afterwards. It doesn't really matter. The interaction is kind of cool. I enjoy it. But for the most part, all you're doing on this spec is spamming Force Lightning as your main sustained damage. And to demolish, once you have all 3 dots up, you can use Leeching Strike, and then you'll just use your Lightning Strike. It is not complex, probably the easiest range DPS rotationally. However, it has a lot of tools. So between dot damage reduction, or damage reduction from your dots, basically put your dots on somebody, you'll get maximum dot damage reduction from this talent. I hit the right button here, sorry. This one's very easy to maintain, very easy to use, and then you would also have this ability right here. It'll give you a little extra damage reduction. Then you have Bubble. Bubble is better to be used for self-healing. When it comes to self-healing, your healing abilities like this one and this one, they're very expensive, very detrimental to your force. So if you don't want to have your force wrecked and you're able to just walk away and not get hit, your bubble is just going to passively heal you for this amount over and over and over. It's a much more effective way to heal up. Also, it does absorb some damage, so that's pretty much for sorcery. You also have a really cool ability like this. This one basically will let you teleport. You can also have that on lightning as well if you choose not to have full rush. So basically, if you're playing with Stormwatch, you're going to have Phase Walk. Then obviously you have the same knock that Sin has if Sin wants to use that, but overall it is a very simplistic range, has great mobility, and this one is focused on dots instead. So it's a lot of internal and elemental, or just internal damage, not elemental. Pyro and Plasma will be the elemental. And then there's some elemental, if I remember correctly, on lighting. Anyway, I could be misremembering there. It might be internal. Regardless, those 2 damage profiles are a little bit less mitigated against. So a lot of people are weak to those damage types. So therefore, that's the reason why I say that. It's kind of relevant. It's really good for tank telling. Not that I recommend tank telling. Obviously, it's just a skill gap kind of issue. Anyway, that's really it for Madness. There's not much to think about here. It's very, very simple, very straightforward. If you're new to the game, you want to play range, Madness is probably the easiest one to get into the game with. All right, now moving into the second range tier. This will be Arsenal Mercenary, same thing as Commando Gunnery. So the whole ideal for this one is a sustain and a burst damage. Most of your burst damage will be Priming Shot, Heat Seeker, and Raw Shot. So these 3 abilities down here. And then you have a vital ability that will give you an auto crit for your Raw Shot. Raw Shot also has a 5x stacking mechanic that increases damage, so when it glows, it does the most damage. So with high velocity, basically supercharged gas, it gives you 100% armor pen on your white damage. So basically, Priming Shot and Raw Shot, I don't remember if Heat Seeker gets 100%, but it gets pretty close if I remember correctly. So therefore, under your burst window, you should pretty much always have supercharged gas up. So the whole ideal here is that you can actually use supercharged gas before you actually get into combat if it is applicable. Sometimes the Warzone maps are a little bit too big, so you're not able to do this. And the whole ideal is to Tracer Blazing to get your stacks for your Priming Shot. And then you would obviously just spam this until you get your stacks, but the whole ideal is basically waiting for your procs, hit the Priming Shot, Heat Seeker, hopefully it crits, and then the Raw Shot. So you can kind of see how the burst compares to what do you call it, tactics and AP. And then this is your main sustain here, Blazing and Tracer. You're just kind of spamming this over and over. And obviously you can always send your burst without supercharged gas. It's not a terrible ideal. Typically want to always keep your burst on cooldown for maximum damage. However, there are sometimes that you will want to hold it for gas windows and surge proc windows. This class has natural built-in surge. This find the right button here, sorry. Is it this one? I swear we have an icon for it, I'm just not seeing it. Just not seeing it, I think we're just blind. All right, well, regardless, let's just proc it the normal way. So this thing right here, advanced targeting or whatever, so basically increases critical hit damage and healing. So basically what happens there is you get extra surge, which is critical hit multiplier. So that allows you to get better value out of your critical. So when you have that proc up, you're kind of just looking for that to line up with other things. So like if you have your other burst up, you get that proc, you have your rod procs, that's when you're going to do your maximum amount of damage. Regardless, there's not much more to that. You're just kind of sitting there watching your buffs and debuffs. Not really debuffs, but your buffs. And then defensively, you have really good tools. So for example, Chaff Flare, really cool ability. It can absorb damage, it can absorb CC. It can help you survive. Good use of Chaff Flare will save you a tremendous amount. Your energy shield will also, when it collapses, heal you. So this is the tankiest of all the range. You have a Reflect if you choose to have it over Jet Out. Jet Out is like the equivalent to Mad Dash. However, it's a little bit better than Mad Dash, but it also has a detrimental effect of getting you stuck sometimes. And then you also have a really cool ability that I didn't showcase to you already, is Net. This basically hinders the player. They're not able to use high mobility or escape abilities, and they're not able to stealth. Very good ability. It can help you secure a lot of kills, but also keep people at bay for you. Other than that, that's kind of Arsenal. Arsenal is just really simplistic, very easy. It's mostly just defensive abilities that are on my bar. Other than that, your main rotation is just basically these 4 abilities and roll shot, and then lining your gas up correctly. Defensively, it's mainly just prioritizing good use of Chaff Flare and Energy Shield, and then you have Reflect and Super Colto to fall back onto as well. You obviously also have Cleanse and Self Heals too, so very loaded class. Hence my name. Now, let's go into IO, as there's not much to talk about for Arsenal. Arsenal's pretty straightforward. Highly recommend it if you're new to the game and you want to play a range, but you don't want to get completely destroyed. However, this class ends up getting tunneled a lot because it doesn't have great mobility. So here is Jet Out. This is like you either get Reflect or you get this. The whole ideal of IO is that you have 2 dots. So you got a range dot here, then you have a elemental dot, and then you have thermal and 2 mag blasts, which pops that, and then you can use a free insta cast and reset your rail shot, or I guess your mag shot, and rinse repeat. The whole ideal here is just kind of permanently power shotting, missile blast, thermal. You're kind of just going through the motions of this just over and over, and then maintaining your dots. And your auto attack actually is very deadly. And during supercharged gas windows, which for whatever reason I don't see my supercharged gas on my bar. Oh, it's on E. But yeah, for the most part, you're just kind of trying to get your stacks up to 10, because during supercharged gas, your dots do a lot more damage, and your auto attack also does a lot more damage. So just give an example of that. Supercharged gas dot, super deadly. And then you have a tactical that also makes it last twice as long. It looks like a lot of damage. It is a lot of damage. It's very hard to mitigate because a lot of it is elemental. So great spec for just killing literally anything. And it also has some of the armor pin that Arsenal has to offer through supercharged gas. Anyway, not much to think about here. Both the specs have a reset for their respected abilities. So for example, this will be mag shot for Sweeping Gunfire, and then for Arsenal it'll be Blazing Bolts. Other than that, this spec is definitely a lot harder to play. Heat management is difficult. It's rotationally a little bit more complex. However, it is not incredibly hard to play. It has mercenary defensive, so that's a benefit, but it's also a downside as it'll get tunneled a lot because it's just able to not really escape. And for the most part, I would highly recommend it. It is not bad, but it's also not the best. I would say that would be it for Mercenary. I believe it leaves us just a last class, which will be Gunslinger or Sniper. All right, now we're on to the final range, and this is the other most pruned class in the game. It's Marauder and this one. However, this one ended up getting some love, so it's definitely not doing anywhere near as bad as Marauder, which is very unfortunate. I wish Marauder would end up getting some love. I'm not doing this with tacticals. Tacticals greatly increase this class's damage by a lot. All 3 tacticals are very important. So for example, Marksman likes 2 different tacticals, Engineering likes 2 different tacticals, and Virulence kind of really only likes 1. However, there are options. For the most part, this is gunslinger, sniper, marksman, sharpshooter. Obviously, marksman sniper is the Imperial version. This is Republic, which is sharpshooter. This one is like your typical kind of like more traditional range. And for the most part, these are the abilities. There's not really anything else to it. The whole ideal is to constantly use abilities off cooldown, but obviously you snipe, follow through, ambush, follow through, penetrating rounds, follow through, rinse, repeat. You have armor pen on follow through, so it ends up being a lot of damage. It can be very fun to play because it's very satisfying, the noise of trick shot and follow through. However, the spec is not doing too well, mostly because of the fact that it has a lot of channeling and a lot of the damage is white damage. If agitating energies was just built into the class baseline, it would be doing a lot better. Unfortunately, it suffers the same problem as Annihilation as being a kind of sustained DPS. However, Ambush, if it was to see some love, it would be very deadly. Recently, it actually got buffed. So it is definitely probably doing a little bit better now, but however, it's still not it's not what you would expect to see the sniper playing. It's also very easy for AoE, pretty much just spam suppressive fire. There's not much else to it. Its AoE is very strong, so it should definitely be respected. Other than that, marksmanship is more so about kind of controlling your target and being more of like a traditional burst range channeler, if that makes sense. Unfortunately, the ambush doesn't do as much damage anymore. However, you do have instant ambush, which does amplify the damage a little bit more, so your ambush is actually pretty deadly. However, if the class has abilities to just recover, it's just not as effective. So you still have good burst, you still have good damage, it's just it falls behind because it's mainly sustain, if that makes sense. Regardless, the class is more so about just kind of spinning everything. So you have a couple abilities that you'll use, and then you'll have a reset to basically reuse all those abilities again. It's a weird class to play defensively. That's where most of the weaknesses come from for this class. So I highly recommend just taking some time learning its defensives and learn how things work. And then learning your rotational loop, as it is very important. A lot of the damage is going to come from your tactical, so you do want to make sure that you have your tactical. Without your tactical, you're arguably not doing much, if at all, any damage. For example, in Virulence, sometimes I forget my tactical, and that's devastating to your damage. Absolutely devastating. So for example, so you would have instant ambush, or you would have agitating energies. The whole ideal there is agitating energy. Use vital shot into penetrating rounds. So basically it reticks your vital shot each penetrating round tick. That's actually super deadly. So you do have some on-demand bursts. Other than that, there is not much to Marksman. It's like a very simple rotational spec. However, Sniper as a whole, defensively, difficult. And it also has a lot of utility available to it. So AoE diversion, AoE knock, things like that make it very good. The passive heal that it gets while it's in cover is incredibly strong. It's actually like 6 to 7k HPS just passively. Another class has that. Definitely should be nerfed, by the way. Now going into Dirty Fighting, which is the equivalent of Virulence. This one is really reliant on its tactical. So the whole ideal here is actually we'll just grab it just so I can show you. I'll do its damage without popping with the tactical. And I'll show you with the tactical. For some reason I'm not remembering what it looks like. There we go. Alright. So I'll put my dots in the target. So we have 2 dots and then we have a white dot. So those are 3 dots. Not really doing a lot of damage. And then I use Cool. Damage mixes up a little bit, but for the most part, the only ability that ends up really doing a lot of damage is your follow through. Obviously, this will be damage over time. Not bad. However, it's not great. Now, with your tactical, this makes it a little bit more efficient, as it gives you some burst to a much needed dot spec. But it also helps your rotational flow as well. So the whole idea here is that we'll get both of our dots, pop our auto crit, pop it, and then go into cool. That is way more damage than what I just did before. Rotationally, this is probably just as easy, if not easier, than playing Sharpshooter or Marksman. And it is also very good. Just like Lethality, it has damage reduction on defense screen or absorb. So whenever that falls off, you do get 50% damage reduction for 6 seconds. Very good. Same concept, you're kind of just using your defensives on cooldown, and you want to try to avoid damage, and then you have a reset for it. The hard part of playing this is defensively. Always remember that. Very easy to play just in general. And again, it's pretty good in AoE. So you put your dots on targets and they get suppress fire. Regardless, this is probably one of the most seen, if not the most seen, sniper spec or gunslinger spec. It's very easy to play, very straightforward, and very enjoyable. Now going into the final sniper spec, we're going to show you Saboteur, since I grabbed the burst spec tactical for lance sideways. I'll grab it for engineering because it's basically pointless to play this without it. You have ruthless interrogation as well that you can also use. It's not bad. However, the main reason to be playing engineering is this tactical right here that I'm putting on. Basically increases your damage from sabotage. To put your sabotage. Okay, so explosive charge only pops on sabotage, and they do 50% more damage. The 50% more damage on top of an auto crit scaling is absolutely broken. I don't think they, with that wording, it makes me feel like they didn't mean to make explosive charge do 50% more damage, but it 100% does. So the whole idea here is that you're going to use explosive charge there, and you get your dots, you get everything ready, and then use this to get your proper sabotage, and then you're going to pop it. There, you didn't really see it, but that was 177k. Kind of a lot higher than that, but that's roughly the max that you'll see in PvP anyway. And then you also hit like a 60k sabotage at the same time. So you're hitting like 250k in one hit splat there. Quite nasty. And then you also have other AoEs like this one and that one, all going at the same time, including the 2 dots that you put on the target. Its burst damage is very high, however, it has a long wait in between its burst damage windows. However, it's not too long of a time, so it is still very deadly. It also has a root on its roll, so it allows it to be very annoying and very anti-melee. For the most part, rotationally, it is a harder spec to play, just like IO, so you want to think about your AoE separately from your single target damage. That's how you'll overcome that, but for the most part, defensively, hard to play rotationally. You have to learn to separate your AoEs from your single target and understand your single target rotation. If you don't, you're just going to repeatedly fail. Other than that, that should cover it. That's all the specs in the game, I think. Obviously I skipped healer. I don't think I missed anything. If I did miss anything, I am so sorry. I highly recommend checking out my videos for any of the classes if you want to see more footage for them. Other than that, I appreciate you guys for watching so far. And if you're just skipping through, totally understand. Hello, and I assume most of you have probably skipped to this specific part. This one will be for Warzones and solo, basically solo play for Warzones. And what I mean by that is not playing with a group. Now, there are some alterations that I would make to this. So for example, Concealment and Carnage, I do find to be a little bit higher on the skill floor required to play and perform on them. However, if you have that skill floor and you start putting time into those, they can be rated better. I wouldn't push Concealment past B, but I also wouldn't push Carnage past A, if that makes sense. But starting off with the top dogs here that are in S tier, Madness, Lightning, Lethality, and Viru. Sorcerer's Kit is very good for 8v8s. You have Phase Walk, you have Force Speed, you have Polarity Shift, Movement Speed, you have Stun Bubble if you want to take that instead. You have a lot of tools that are just very useful on larger maps. So that is just naturally going to give you an advantage. Madness is incredibly easy to play, but also its output is very good. The main reason why you don't see Madness orcs doing damage is because of their actions per minute is not very high. They're not staying on target and they're not fighting a lot. A lot of the Madness orcs that you see these days are a little bit too focused on dueling and drawing people out and trying to duel instead of actually just doing team fighting. Team fighting is not a complicated thing for Madness, actually. You just have dot for the most part or dot spread into doing your sustained target or sustained single target rotation, and obviously with some AoE that you would have. So sometimes there are situations where you would want to use the AoE Tempest of, or not Tempest of Roar, but the AoE Lightning Strike, whatever it's called. It's actually very good anytime you can actually do team fighting, as it will also proc Tempest of Roar. And then you also have the AoE Demolish as well that you could take. Obviously giving up Tempest of Roar, that can also be very good. So it has AoE options and it has really good single target, and it also has a full-on single target build and a more of a duelist style if you decide to go that way. So it does make sense why a lot of Madness players are currently playing that way. However, it is definitely the top dog for 8v8s when you're playing solo. And then you have Lightning. Lightning is basically taking that whole ideal of a team fighter up to 10. It's using all of Sorcerer's strengths to basically team control and do a lot of AoE damage. It also has a single target build that is absolutely deadly and it makes it a better duelist. However, defensively, it's not as good as Madness, but it's not horrible. Ultimately, Lightning is probably some of the most fun that you can have on a range, especially as a mobile range. Then we go into Lethality. Lethality is basically an unpruned melee from last expansion, which is amazing. You're dot focused, but you also have pretty much utility for every branch. You do healing, you do cleansing, you have CC, you have decent mobility, and you have pretty decent damage, and your AoE damage is respected. Your single target pressure is still very good. You have armor pin built into most of your damage, which allows, or not most of your damage, but Corrosive Assault now has armor pin. So therefore, your damage is still very deadly on heavy armor targets. That didn't used to be a thing last expansion. Viru also got that option as well. So Viru is also great. Its range, I would probably rank it the easiest and definitely the strongest right now. However, sniper defensives tend to be a little bit more difficult for players. Now to get into engineering, starting with the A tier. Engineering is really good defensively. Again, just like Virulence, I think is a little bit harder for people to get into defensively, so I'm not going to rate it as high. And also the skill floor for the class is a little bit higher, as most of the rotation for engineering seems to complicate things for people. They don't seem to understand it. Best rule of thumb I can give you is separate your AoEs from your single target damage and understand your single target priority and rotation. Once you've got that, then focus on adding your AoEs into the mix. Overuse of AoE is how you kind of really ruin your rotation and ruin your energy management, so take that with a grain of salt. Then going into the first melee outside of lethality, Rage. Rage is very good at small skirmishes and just in general, like focusing down range. A lot of the range right now are going to be doing a lot of slow, so you're going to get a lot of pulled hatred. You're going to be hitting like a truck. You're going to be able to absolutely bully these reroll range players. However, you're still going to be a front line, so you're going to not really enjoy life because there's going to be a lot of range, and you're probably going to be the only melee sometimes. That's going to suck. Lethality is definitely a little bit better and more well equipped to handle that. However, you're still going to have a lot of fun. AP is kind of like in the same situation. I would say the skill floor is a little bit higher, but the skill ceiling is a little bit lower. There's a plateau that you definitely hit for AP. However, it is very rewarding to play. Just like Rage, you can absolutely destroy people, and it can be very fun. One thing about AP that's going to be really nice, even though armor ability got nerfed a little bit, is that Vent Heat is a talent that we normally take anyway. Afterburners is what it's called. Each time a chain lightning is going to hit us, it's going to amplify our damage by 10% and vent some of our heat. So if you had issues learning how to play AP because of your heat management, this is probably the best time to try to play it and have some fun. And then Pyro, pretty much the same thing. Your single target damage is kind of bad, but your AoE is good. You're very tanky as a trade-off, but unfortunately, since most people are going to be ranged, you're not going to enjoy it as much. I wouldn't say that it's a B tier because it's so good at oppressing other melee, but it's also just really good in general and has high survivability. I rank it here. Pyro could definitely go down a little bit, but just in the grand view of things, I think this is definitely where it should probably be. Marksman is another one. Sniper's kit, really good. Its damage is a little bit more simple to use. It's kind of like Virulence, but a little bit more simple than that, even, if you can believe that. Overall, there's not much to think about for Marksman. I just don't think it's that bad, but I also don't think it's that great. Anytime you're dealing with a lot of Saber Ward or Deflection classes, you probably don't want to play Marksman, because it's not a fun time, but other than that, it's usually really good against a lot of mercenaries, a lot of Sorks, just in general. Maybe not always Sorks, but for the most part, things that don't have defense chance defensives that are going to basically cause you to miss. Carnage, similar concept. However, the skill floor for the class, I would say, is a lot higher. So I wouldn't recommend this class unless you've put some time on it already. There's not too much to think about it because it doesn't have a lot of buttons, but you are thinking 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 over and over for your shards of Mortis. Just kind of like AP, where you go 1, 2, 3, 4 over and over. Once you have that down and you have that muscle memory, you'll find both of these classes performing a lot better. And defensively, Rotter is horrible, so do take that with a grain of salt. Then I would say Arsenal. Arsenal has a great defensive kit. The only issue is that its mobility is horrible. Its mobility actually did get buffed, and then you also got a buff to Heat Seekers. Unfortunately, Heat Seekers didn't need a damage buff, it needed a critical hit chance buff. If anything, Real Shot should not be an auto crit, and Heat Seeker should be the auto crit. That would immediately fix the damage profile for Arsenal. And on top of that, if Jet Out was to become baseline, the talented version holds the second charge and you only get one charge. And also, they build in a root break to Jet Out. I think that would also help fix the mobility issue. And then IO is kind of the same thing. IO is only below Arsenal because Arsenal is easier to play. There's a lot of channeling on IO, and it's a lot easier to shut down. Then I would go into Vengeance. Vengeance is still going to be a frontliner. Its single target is lacking. Its AoE got nerfed. It's not horrible, but it's definitely more durable than Hatred and Deception, while still being comparable in damage to Hatred. I can't really say too much about Vengeance, unfortunately, since it did just get nerfed. However, I don't think it's as bad as most people think. Hatred, probably the only spec in the game I would say I'd still have fun kamikazing on. There's just something about it. You're being able to get out 3 death fields and a 100k plus eradicate. There's something about it, it just feels good. And then when people clump up, you can get a lot of death field resets and just absolutely wipe an entire team just by yourself. That feels amazing. I really like the reset playstyle on it. Assassin's always kind of been about that reset playstyle, and having that on Hatred just feels amazing. I think it's a cool design. I really enjoy it. But defensively, the class is absolutely paper. You probably couldn't play anything else other than like out of cover sniper that will die faster than this one. So definitely think about that before you ever play it. However, it is very enjoyable. Deception, it does have a brawler kind of build that you can play with the damage reduction and AoE discharge. However, I wouldn't say it's a great class, and the skill floor for the class can be low. However, when it comes to actually brawling and understanding your general movement kit, you need to be able to maximize that and use your CC properly to actually thrive. Otherwise, this is just going to feel absolutely awful to play, and I rank it as such. So definitely want to be a little bit better at Deception if you want to try to do that. Then lastly, we have the last three specs, Annihilation, Fury, and Concealment. Now, Concealment is a tricky one because it is very good at objectives. And it has a damage reduction talent that can be good, so it can be a bit of a brawler in small skirmishes, kind of like Carnage. The only issue is that you run into a higher skill floor, if that makes sense. So I wouldn't recommend it until you've played it for a while and you've got a general understanding of how to play it. And then for Annihilation and Fury, they're both sustained DPS classes, or specs right now. So unfortunately, in PvP, the game's not really designed around that right now. And a lot of your damage is coming from uptime. So for example, Spiteful Saber, and for Fury, your damage is just mixed. Pretty much everything hits hard. So at the moment somebody pops defensives, it feels like you're doing absolutely no damage. And also defensively, both of them have the Marauder kit, which definitely doesn't make them feel too great to play. I'd love to see Marauder get some love. It's still the most pruned class in the game, so hopefully something happens there, and I would love to see Concealment get Revitalizers back. I do think that would be good. I think the DR on Lacerate is a cool ideal, but I think that should definitely be either free or Revitalizers should come back, one or the other. All right, stepping into the next part here for group play. So this one is going to be different, and the main reason why is because you're going to have a tank and healer most of the time. So therefore, some classes do perform a lot better with support, and some classes don't perform as well with support. So first things to take off here, AP is ranked the way it is because it's so efficient at multiple different things. It's very versatile, and it is arguably the best melee with support, next to lethality. So really, AP could be at the end here or at the beginning. It doesn't actually matter that much. It is definitely an S tier, I would say. Then we would have Lightning. I think Lightning is absolutely excellent as a group composition. If you were to play 8v8 regs, having Lightning plus pretty much anything is going to be good. Lightning brings a lot of team control, but also brings a lot of AoE damage. It also just has, in general, a decent kit, so it allows it to be a lot more slippery, meaning that typically your group's not going to take as much damage, as it's going to be able to kind of get out of there, and unlike Vengeance, that's just going to jump in there and take a crap ton of damage. It is going to be out of the way, out of sight, out of range. Now, going into Virulence, this one is always going to be really good because its defensive kit is not too bad. It's the better one of all three sniper specs, and then damage-wise, it's not the very best, I would say, but it is definitely the most versatile for 8v8. So most of the time, it's going to be doing really well. Overall, this one can't really go wrong. This kind of complements pretty much any other melee in the game or other range in the game. However, for the most part, there are situations and compositions that this class won't feel as good. Same thing goes for like Lightning. And then going into Madness, Madness is really just an APM thing. Typically, again, the same problem with solo gameplay. So a lot of Madness players are just not doing the APM required to push out the damage. There are some build variations that you will have to make it better for group gameplay. And some Madness players are just not willing to do that. However, that doesn't make them any worse, if that makes sense. This class is definitely really good and it has potential in the right hands, so I rated it accordingly, not accordingly to how people actually play it currently. And then going into Engineering, again, I only ranked this one slightly lower because of its defensive kit. I do think it's a great shutdown DPS, but I don't think it is the best one to do it, if that makes sense. So there are issues with Engineering that are very unique, especially in 8v8s. Explosive Probe missing or just getting basically consumed by somebody dying. It's not a great way to use Explosive Probe, but sometimes you're not going to have much of a choice, if that makes sense. Sometimes random things happen in 8v8. Some people either get global or they'll just randomly die, and there's not much you can really do about it, which will heavily hurt its damage output. And for the most part, its control is the main reason why it's definitely one of the best for A. If not, it could be at the bottom of S. I would be very wary about it because I do feel like the other specs just do everything that it can do better. The only exception is pure single target shutdown. That's probably really the only exception, and I can't really say it has a leg up over like virulence. Let's say if there was potentially multiple of them, I do think engineering would probably be ultimately the most disgusting thing that you ever have to deal with if there's multiple engineering, just like multiple lightning, multiple AP, multiple lethality, madness, Viru, all these stacked, horrible to deal with. So I can't really judge it that way. So do take that with a grain of salt. I do think engineering is maybe iffy on this placement here, but it's not the end of the world here. Then Rage, I really do think Rage can be really good. The only issue of Rage is that it is very squishy and you're going to take a lot of damage. This is a problem in tank heal support games. If you're taking too much damage and you're not trying to mitigate it pretty well, your healer is not going to be able to keep up. Your tank's going to die through guard. There's going to be a lot of issues, so therefore I don't rank it as high. However, you do have really good shutdown potential and you have really good damage at dealing with like range, and that's very important, especially with lightning and madness being as good as they are. Then I would rank Pyro mainly just because it is so tanky and it's going to be able to deny pretty much any other melee in the game, and pretty much not much more than that. It's very tanky as well, so it definitely helps alleviate the issue of being a melee. And then I would say Carnage, and I say that with a question mark mostly just because it is a skill floor issue. If you're not up to par at the very minimum of Carnage, you're not going to find much success, and it's not going to be that fun to play. You're still going to be a frontliner, and that's going to be a problem. You really want to play it as like a pick-off class for it to really excel. I wouldn't rank it as low as B, but again, it is a niche, if that makes sense. Then I would go to Marksman. The main reason why I don't rate Marksman higher is just because of its damage profile. It's a lot of white damage. Typically isn't going to be as meta as the other types of damage. And then on top of that, there are situations where you're just not going to feel like you're doing any damage, especially if you end up getting tunneled, because you're not going to have time to channel, because you're going to be trying to reposition. You can't just sit there and face tank it. Stork is very good at dealing with sniper, so that's a problem for Marksman because it doesn't have the extra defensive power that Virulence has, and it doesn't have the extra shutdown and yellow damage that Engineering has, so I do feel like it's in the right spot. Arsenal, another really nice one. It's very easy to play, good defensives. Overall, it's not a negative, and it may not pull super high numbers across the board. It has a very effective high burst that will get somebody killed no matter what. This is the spec that you really want to play if you really want somebody to die. I don't think there's a better class for it. Arsenal, when it crits all three of its burst abilities, it absolutely annihilates somebody. And then we have IO. IO, again, still a lot easier with the shutdown. Has great damage and a good damage profile. It can do a lot more. It can do a lot more overall damage and a lot more effective damage to the tank, as most dot specs do. However, these dots are very deadly. They're elemental and they hurt a lot. So, therefore, with that speaking, if you're playing against a jug tank and you're playing IO, you can definitely shred that jug tank like it's nobody's business. Then we have Vengeance. Vengeance is not terrible. It's a good melee. Not as good as Pyro in terms of being able to shut down other melee. However, if left unchecked, you're going to just team wipe by yourself, which feels amazing. Hatred's kind of like in the same spot as Vengeance, but it's even more squishy. So you have the benefits of having insane reset and burst potential for AoE. However, it's just not durable to manage that. Then the last one, we have Deception. There's very few uses for Deception and group gameplay for AV8s. There is the Brawler build, and that's probably about it. There are some other builds that you can run where you're just kind of like sitting on one target. However, Deception is just not tanky enough to basically dance with the other specs right now. And without the DR talent being baseline, it is a problem. So you're pretty much always forced into that, and you're going to lose some damage for that. And if you decide not to take that, you're taking a gamble. So therefore, I think it's in the right spot. Then I would say Annihilation. This one could be really good, but the problem is the class is just too easy to bully. Its defensive profile is horrible. Its damage profile isn't too bad. However, it's very reliant on hitting slash to do consistent damage. It's a sustained DPS, just like Fury. So it comes into the issue of uptime. Anytime there's classes like Lightning playing the game or Sniper, your uptime is always going to be questionable, so therefore it's just not as valuable as it could be. And then the same thing goes for Fury, almost word for word. Unfortunate. And then we have Concealment. Concealment just doesn't fit for the most part. There are times that you can definitely play it because there's skill gap in 88s. Do take that into consideration. However, it's not going to perform on the same level as the other classes. It's mainly only going to perform anywhere near remotely as good when there's a massive skill gap or there's just a way better team versus a weaker team. All right, now we're going into Arena SoloQ. The best specs I would say generally are going to be Lethality and Madness, and then you have a situational placement here for Concealment, Engineering, and Virulence. I do consider Engineering and Virulence to be incredibly good in arenas. Unfortunately, there are a lot of situations where it won't be as good, and it really comes down to variation of what's in the queue. There's a massive skill gap, persistence in every single match of Arena these days. So there are some times that you're going to just absolutely hard carry on either of these, and other times you're not. Concealment is the same way. If there is no tanks and no heals, I feel like you can sometimes do absolutely insane. Sometimes with a tank and a healer, you can do even better. And then there's some situations where it feels like having a tank or a healer can negatively impact. So for example, having a healer when you're playing Deception and Hatred doesn't feel very good. Same thing with Fury. However, if you have a tank playing these classes, can feel quite good. Really, when it comes to classes that are more off-healing focused, having a tank is not always that great. However, if your off-healing is superb, it's not that bad. When it comes to having a healer in that situation, usually not having a healer is sometimes better because your damage mitigation profile isn't as good and you're a little bit more focused on healing. So for example, Lightning. Having a healer is great, but eventually you're probably going to die because your defenses just aren't up to par. So you have to really rely on your kiting ability and your healer's ability to stay with you. However, with a tank, it's a little bit different. You kind of face things a little bit better, and you can heal through a lot of damage a lot better, which definitely feels a lot better. And things like AP become an absolute monster when you give them a guard, and much less so when they just have a healer. So with that out of the way, we're going to start with Lethality, Madness. Typically, they just have everything available to them, everything they could possibly want for arenas. It's just kind of like their playing field. Concealment is basically a higher skill floor requirement to actually perform on. However, they are absolutely great. Engineering and Virulence, as we've talked about, I feel are very good. They are an asset to your team. They're very valuable. They have great utility. They have great damage, and they have, I wouldn't say great defensives, but it really just depends on how the sniper plays. If they are pretty decent, they are pretty much always going to be an extreme value, probably more so than most of the other classes that you might have on your team. Looking at something like Vengeance, or even sometimes something like AP. Like if you have Engineering with AP, markedly you're both just as important as each other. Anyway, moving on from S tier, I would say Deception. Deception immediately falls off the moment that there's support roles in the queue. It doesn't feel as fun to play. However, it is still very good. Its taunts has a consistent combat reset. For the most part, its damage profile is not bad while having good CC. Then I would say Lightning. The only issue with Lightning is that you can be shut down, and it becomes very annoying to consistently play when you're always the target. Sometimes that will be the problem. And dealing with assassins as Sork is just absolutely miserable, especially as Lightning. However, I do not think it's bad by any means, and when you're playing Stormwatch, you absolutely nuke people. So really, it's just about nuking somebody and then surviving long enough to just automatically win, pretty much. There are some different situations where you have to do a lot more work for yourself. However, a lot of the off-healing specs of the game kind of just rely on staying alive and or just nuking somebody and staying alive. and that's pretty much the gameplay loop. And then you have AP. Now this one usually alters in whether there's a support role in the queue or there's another higher priority target or another target that can actually taunt for it to allow it to be a lot more tanky. Its defenses are very straightforward, so therefore if it has another class that's able to support it, it's not going to feel as bad. But if it's a solo melee and there's no other taunts in the match, it typically ends up not feeling too great. And for the most part, there is a minimum skill floor that you need to sufficiently play AP in Arena. Other than that, it is a simplistic and straightforward. I think it's about where it should be, and it is incredibly good, one of the best if it has a tank. Then I would say Marksman. Marksman kind of like falls into the same category where if people have a lot of like saber wards and just defense chance, defensives in general, like deflection, it's not going to be doing so hot, but it still has sniper's kit, it still has cover heal, it still has decent mobility and hololocate if it needs it. I do think that's definitely going to help a lot, and it's going to make it a little bit harder for the average player these days to chase or just deal with it. However, against something like engineering and MM, or engineering and like AP, you're probably not going to have a good time. However, it's definitely not as bad as some of the other specs. MM could be questionable in its placement. It could go down to B, and I wouldn't argue with that. Carnage, this is really just, again, same thing, skill floor. If there's a tank, you're going to absolutely pop off. If there's not a tank, you're going to be in a position where people can just burst you and force you out constantly. However, with a healer and just basically support at all, it just feels a lot better to play. I feel like Annihilation is the same thing, but if there's a situation where it's a burst-heavy queue, Annihilation doesn't feel that fun to play, as you're not going to be able to counteract a lot of the burst. So therefore, Annihilation is going to feel a little bit better with a tank and less better with a healer. Then going into Arsenal and IO, your defensive profile is great. You're typically not going to be a target, so it's going to be very important for you to learn how to do damage while you're free casting and using your comp missile to get people out of the comp, or basically not combat, but get them out of the fight for a little bit. Overall, I don't think it's bad. Net is extremely valuable. I think they're probably in roughly the right place. It could change a little bit, but I think this is probably where they belong to be, because it's not incredibly hard to target them and focus them down, but also at the same time, it's really not too hard to shut down their damage profile either. And the main advantage of the class is pretty much using its defensives and being able to soak up as much damage as they can. However, most people are smart enough these days to not just tunnel into them and also not basically try to deal with it just by themselves. Then we have Pyro. Pyro is really good at taking damage. However, its damage profile, it's not going to allow it to do too much damage. The longer it lives, the higher chance that it has to win. The same thing goes for Rage. They're kind of just like, and even Vengeance in a way. They're all kind of just trying to survive until they get defenses back or just do enough damage that they eventually just kill somebody and trade. It's a weird playstyle. It's not a fun one anymore. And I wouldn't say it's bad, but I wouldn't say it's good either. All three of these specs feel not as fun. You're pretty much always going to be first target, just like AP. And then last two, I would say Fury and Hatred. Both of these can be really good in 4 DPS matches. However, anytime that it's not a 4 DPS match, it's really just reliant on tank. You'd have more fun with a tank and less fun with a healer. However, Fury can still have fun with a healer. Hatred, not so much, because healing through basically a Hatred taking damage is just not, it's not going to happen. You're not going to do it. It's not going to be fun. Hatred's going to hate it and wish you just had never queued. So that is pretty much it for my tier list here for solo arenas. There definitely are some swaps here, but for the most part, I think this is relatively accurate. And without spending too much time on this, I think this is pretty good. All right, now this is the final one. This one is very important on group composition. So for example, depending on the tank that you're playing with, your group's going to want to build around that. So for example, if you're playing with a Pyrotech tank, you're going to probably want to play pressure So things like engineering and AP are still good. Engineering AP is the most versatile of both of the respected formats. So, for example, AP melee, engineering range. They're able to do cleave and single target very well. So it definitely complements all three tanks. However, let's say if you were to play APT tank and you didn't want to play AP engineering, you'd be looking at like pyro engineering or something like lethality pyro, double pyro, virulence pyro, lethality, stuff like that. You're looking at things that are going to be doing an overwhelming amount of dot damage. And the simpler you make it, the better PT tank is going to be, if that makes sense, because PT tank can only do so much, and you want to just try to spam control and get as much damage out as possible. Now, with that said, AP engineering is pretty much undeniably the best. Double AP can be very good. However, engineering just directly counters melee just in general. So engineering can kind of just always deny that meta. AP lethality used to be the king for last expansion. Unfortunately, sniper is just very, very good right now. A sniper is not just good, its cover heal specifically is so strong that it's doing 6 to 7, 8k healing per second to itself throughout the entire match. So effectively, it's doing a lot of self-healing, which is very powerful, and I do think it should be adjusted. It's definitely a little too strong, and if Carnage Marauder was to get the same kind of like healing output, I don't think anybody would really complain except for the people that have to play against really good Marauders, because that stuff is actually really strong. And if you were to give that to Marauder, people would definitely complain about it. I don't understand why people don't complain about it right now. People seem to think that the TR, RO, whatever tactical is the main reason why engineering is as good as it is, but it's most definitely a cover heal, and that puts sniper just in general a leg up over all the other range classes, and just in general also melee. It becomes a great complement to pretty much any team. Then going into lethality, pyro, and virulence, the main reasons why that these aren't as good as the other ones is because lethality can get shut down a lot easier than it could last expansion. Pyro's damage has been nerfed not once but twice, and its single target is lacking. And then virulence is a white damage spec still, so you're still reliant on landing a lot of white damage, and if you do miss your dot explosion, you're going to be feeling a massive damage drop off, which is not going to feel very good. You do have decent survivability, and against PTs in general, it's not going to feel as bad. But if somebody was to randomly bring rage, you're not going to be having as much fun. Now, also, for the most part, it really also depends on the composition that you're playing. So sometimes lethality and pyro just doesn't have room to play, if that makes sense. And virulence, like why bring virulence if you have engineering? Then going into the B tier, I would say Rage, Madness, Lightning, Marksman, Carnage, and Anni. I think Carnage can still do a lot of damage, however, it becomes a liability, so you need to have a really tanky composition, so Carnage can have guard a lot to make it even remotely work. Predation definitely helps, but because it is so squishy, you kind of either need the enemy team to also agree to play the same thing, and or just get lucky and hope that people are not playing the meta, if that makes sense. Marksman is kind of the same way. You gotta hope that there's not engineering, because engineering will absolutely shut you down. And then Madness and Lightning can be very good, but unfortunately it is so heavily trained by melee with guard that you're just not going to have fun, and on top of that, you're usually not going to perform. You have to be a very good sword player, and you have to understand kiting and a lot of other things. So the skill floor just to play a range in arenas in general is going to be naturally higher, but there is a skill floor as well for playing melee pretty well. So typically, whatever route you go, chances are there's a lot of nuances that you have to learn of each individual one that you have to play. However, the things that are currently at the top, you can kind of skip past some of that. So for example, lethality, you don't have to be the best melee player to play lethality. It's not that hard. AP as well. And then when it comes to range engineering, you also don't have to be the best player. You just have to understand your rotational kit and your defensive kit a lot better. However, you don't really have to actually play it too much to understand or get the full value out of it. Now, if you are being triple tunneled, that's a completely different story. However, that's not too common. So then going into Rage, Rage is really good mainly because of Reflect. If Rage was to get Reflect baseline, I do think it would be A tier. I think it would be definitely a lot more viable than what it currently is. I do think Juggernauts do need something, but not a lot. I think Reflect being baseline would just be the obvious solution to the class. And for the most part, I don't think it's bad, but I also don't think it's good against certain comps. So for example, if there's a Lethality or Pyro or just like a lot of cleave in general, like AP Engi, you're not really going to get away with Rage like at all. And then for Madness, it's kind of like the same issue of Lightning. Like you would probably want to go after the sniper, and if there's not a sniper, you got to pray to God there's not double melee and you're going to get triple melee trained. That's going to be an absolute nightmare. So it's really just a stipulation of what you're playing against, and when you don't know, I think this rating is definitely exactly where it should be. And then when it goes to the last one, IO, too easy to shut down, unfortunately. Has a good damage profile, but it is going to be trained. There's very low chances that you get to just do whatever you want and or get a single channel off. You're going to be a very high priority of the shutdown. And on top of that, it's going to make it a lot easier for the tank to guard off the other DPS that you're playing with. And then we have Vengeance. It's just going to take way too much damage, and people are not going to stack for Vengeance. So the main thing that you're bringing there with Vengeance is playing around a comp that's going to lock down somebody extremely hard and try to cleave off of them. However, it is a simple strategy and not too hard to play around. Then you have Arsenal. Arsenal is primarily white damage and very inconsistent in its burst windows, so therefore it's just not the one that you would typically play over all the other specs in the game. I do think it's in a relatively decent spot for the list. I don't think it's the worst. I would say it's probably comparable to Annihilation, but the problem is with Annihilation, putting Annihilation on a mercenary in general kind of relegates the mercenary into uselessness, because Predation is going to obviously have issues with you landing your abilities in general, but also at the same time, Annihilation's damage profile is going to eat through your defensives. Then you also have Fury. Fury just, it isn't great, but it's not horrible. I would say it's better than Hatred and Deception. However, I do feel like some situations Deception can be better. However, most of these specs just don't get play. We're not actually going to truly know until there is a situation where people are not playing AP Engineering, or AP Engineering is just not as good as it currently is. Personally, I think all these specs should be brought up to the bar of APPT. I think that's the bar, and that should just be where it's set. I think Engineering Burst should be knocked down a peg. I think the bar for range should be set at probably Lightning or Virulence, and everything should just be balanced around that. I think that's just a good spot to be, and I think healers should get buffed. But until then, this is about as complete and complete I can make a tank heal tier list. Other than that, I appreciate you guys for watching. This is a long one, I know. Hopefully it answered any of your questions. If it didn't, feel free to leave a question in the comment. I'll be more than happy to help.